before he was killed, Gandhi had actually made sure, just before independence, that India should take its place, in fact go at the founding of the UN, before India was even independence. He wanted my grandmother there, Vijayalakshmi Pandit, to represent India at the UN. And she was actually, later she became president of the UN, but at that time she was a complete outlier. She was sort of camping out, you know, in the lobby of a hotel. She was supported by Indian activists. She was supported by a grand coalition of an anti-racist movement, the National Association of Colored People, W.E. Du Bois, Walter White, the American Civil Liberties Association, and so on, all of whom had converged on San Francisco at the founding conference of the UN because they knew that they needed some other law, more than national law. They needed a framework of rights in order to be able to govern a post-war world. That it wasn't just to be a settlement between the great powers, but it was to be to do with the individual rights of human beings. And my grandmother, again, even before India became independent, then went to the General Assembly after it was formed and brought the case of South Africa. So one of the first times when a government was interfering in the sovereign affairs of another government, because all through the Nazi murders, there was actually no settled law that could interfere with the legal actions of one state to its own citizens, even if when they declared them complete non-citizens. So she argued that as part of an anti-racist front. And in fact, indeed, here in Manchester in 1945, there was a Pan-African Congress meeting in which many of the leaders who later became national leaders in South Africa, in Africa, in various parts of Africa, came. There were ex-servicemen who were here and so on, who were arguing for equality and against empire and so on. So that was one person. The other was Hansa Mehta, who sat on the drafting committee of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And she brought with her a charter that had already been developed by the women's movement in India of rights and responsibilities, which was an incredibly radical document. I mean, this had been developed during the 1930s. India at that time didn't have full adult suffrage. It did have a form of suffrage, but it was a property electorate. And women did vote, but it was full equality for women, a uniform civil code, protections for labor, etc., co-education, the abolition of the stigma of illegitimacy, free and full consent in marriage, which must be monogamous. And we're still fighting for those things. These have not yet been won. But one of the key achievements that she had many achievements, including the first sentence, all human beings are equal in dignity and rights, where she said if you say all men, women will not be read into it automatically. You have to say human beings. So that was one of her, where she negotiated with Eleanor Roosevelt and others. But there's a clause on marriage, and that's free and full consent in marriage. And that clause, which I think subsequent generations of feminists did not understand how radical it was. It was not part, there were many people who contributed to the drafting of the Universal Declaration. There wasn't one mind behind it. But it was not part of a classic civil liberties discourse drawn from French rights or anything. It was in fact considered by Eleanor Roosevelt quite vulgar to talk about something like marriage. I mean, people understood Roosevelt's four freedoms. They understood freedom of speech, they understood freedom of religion, and various things like that, protection for religion. They did not understand why marriage should be there. And of course, this clause was immediately, it was condemned by American anthropologists who hate any kind of advance. It was condemned by the American Bar Association because it broke segregation laws in America, because it allowed interracial marriage. It broke, it was of course condemned by the South Africans, it was condemned by the Saudis, who didn't vote for the Universal Declaration, but it got through. And it got through as a law which allowed marriage of choice. It allowed people to marry outside their community, so it allowed interracial marriage. The implications were that it allowed intercaste marriage, which was one of the big dividing issues. Gandhi and Ambedkar had many debates about this, and Ambedkar persuaded Gandhi that interfaith, intercaste marriages were particularly important, and apparently Gandhi said that he would support that, and so on. So that was the background with which not only was the Indian constitution formed, there were 15 women who sat in the Constituent Assembly, and young women now say, why only 15? But this was, I think, the first Constituent Assembly in which any women sat. They came from all religious backgrounds, from caste backgrounds, Dalit women, and so on, and they contributed to building the constitution. And that's why, in the fight against Hindutva, there is such a strong sense of ownership of the constitution. So you have left-wing students, and you really can't imagine this in Britain, standing with posters saying, we will defend our constitution, we want our constitutional rights, so pledging to defend the constitution, and so on. And that, of course, relates to what was going on in the courts in India to undermine what secular law there was, because there is one civil marriage law, which is called the Special Marriage Act, and it's an old 19th century law, but it is the law which allows people to marry across interfaith lines. It's been undermined in Pakistan and Bangladesh. It has the same law. I'm not sure it exists in Pakistan anymore, but in Bangladesh you have to renounce your religion if you marry somebody of another religion, which is of course quite a dangerous thing to do. People may not want to do it. But even though this law exists, there were groups of people, there were cells as they're called, so sort of BHP or RSS people in the courts, because you have to put up notices about this law. If you're planning to marry under that law, you can't just rock up and get married. You have to put up a notice. These notices are monitored, so it's dangerous for interfaith couples, particularly couples who are running away from their family, to marry in order to do that. And so you find instances where women go to court, or they get persuaded, they get told stories about the man that they're intending to marry. Oh, he's already married, he has several other wives, didn't you know? Their parents are contacted. You have magistrates making it mandatory to solemnize interreligious marriages only with the prior permission of district collectors, which is not the law at all. So there has been an undermining attack on marriage. There have been a physical attack. So a woman, my namesake Gita was killed for having had an interfaith marriage. And there's a man called Babu Bajrangi, who was a BJP, he was a strong man who recovered many Hindu women who married Muslim men or men from other regions or castes. And with the help of the law judiciary, kidnapped these women and forced them to divorce their husbands and arrange their marriages to Hindu men. So the courts have been an arena of struggle. There is the secular law. People do take recourse to it, but in positions of danger. And meanwhile, there's a discourse about Muslim women that they must only solve these problems within their community. That is often from the liberals and the secularists, saying to Muslim women that the pluralism of laws is actually part of the fabric of Indian tolerance. And Muslim law in India has remained unreformed, so it's much, much more backward than law in Pakistan and Bangladesh, because they had reforms of Muslim law, whereas Hindu law in those countries has remained utterly unreformed and not at all protective. So you have the situation where you had a case where various Muslim women's organizations took a case against what's called triple talaq, that is the sort of repudiation divorce, to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court ruled in their favor. But then the measures the government brought in were not so much protective of women as criminalizing the men. So it was about taking a stand that in the end didn't help. So the women who'd actually taken that case then argued against the government's measures. But what's really frightening from the point of view of looking at this in Britain is that Indian Muslim law, the most backward, as I said, of the subcontinent, is often used in the informal Sharia courts in this country. because their purpose, of course, is to roll back any kind of law reform that's happened in other parts of the world of Muslim law and to use the worst forms. And that many Indian liberals don't understand this and actually don't understand the links between what's happening there and what's happening here. And yet we hear Muslim feminists say exactly what we're saying that's happening in this country, is that women are being pushed into these alternative forums as alternative dispute resolution and so on. They're being kept out of the courts, not being able to recourse their rights in the courts. So it's a complicated situation which the women's movement has tried to negotiate through, as I said, through individual law reform, but it hasn't really solved this problem. Now, as well as the issue of marriage, the issue of protection of the cow, which leads to lynching of people who are thought to be dealing in cattle illegally or eating beef and so on, there has been a major attack on, not just on freedom of expression and on writers and rationalists, but on the scientific temper itself. And I think the best commentator we can think of is actually a Pakistani freethinker and friend, Parvez Hudboy, who's been involved with various campaigns against nuclear armament in Pakistan and many other things. And he said, he talks about how Nehru as the first prime minister who insisted on this scientific temper and being put that in the constitution, again, highly unusually. And Hudboy says, if this hadn't happened, instead of being noted for its exceptional space program and brilliant string theorists, India would have become a garbage dump for every kind of crackpot science. Medical research would have concentrated on medicines made from cow urine and cow dung. The celibacy of peacocks would be under intense scrutiny. Astrology would, because somebody said peacocks fertilized by their tears. Astrology would be taught in place of astronomy, and instead of teaching actual mathematics, there would be Vedic mathematics. As in Pakistan, Darwinian evolution would be considered heretical and destructive of religious faith. And in Indian academia, or academics of Indian origin abroad also has its own versions of these arguments. And particularly in an area of study called science studies, an academic called Meera Nanda has argued that the academic left has no resources to deal with the religious right and anti-science views because it's become so relativist in its own thinking. And this has meant that science studies has lent itself to the promotion of Hindutva views on science, which are distinct from but allied to other anti-science theories from Christian and Muslim fundamentalists. In other words, while Euro-American and Indian academics can recognize populism, fascism, and far-right movements as a threat when they come from the majority, their answer is to embrace the same ideas when they're classified as the other. If universalism is rejected as a principle, then the only means of determining where you stand is either to stand with your tribe or to stand with the tribes of the other. And in the course of all that, this attack on the scientific temper, we come back to one of the central theories that pins Hindutva in place. Because if it's a land of blood and soil, the land of the territory and the land of the people in it, and if those people are Aryan, then they have to be the original inhabitants of India, the people known as the Aryans. And Golwalkar, as I said, one of the early ideologues, said, "Out of the heap of hypotheses, we reject all and positively maintain that we Hindus came into this land from nowhere, but are indigenous children of the soil always, from time immemorial, and natural masters of the country. Here we compiled our inimitable Vedas, reasoned out our philosophy of the absolute, the last word on the subject, built our sciences and arts and crafts. Here we progressed in cultivation, industries, and trade, flourished and prospered, a great nation of a great race, propounded the one religion which is no make-believe, but religion in essence." And therefore, all scientific studies in archaeology, linguistics, and so on have to be manipulated in order to show that the Aryans came first. And there was actually a huge urban civilization in India, which more and more sites in which are being discovered, very, very advanced urban civilization. Two major sites are now in Pakistan, Harappa and Mohenjo-daro. But there have been excavations done on modern-day India's soil as well. But it becomes a problem as to what to do with these excavations, because scientific methods of finding DNA from very ancient corpses, thousands of years old, skeletons thousands of years old, have been found. There recently, according to India Today, a report revealed details of a history committee convened by the Office of the Director General of the Archaeological Survey of India. Its task, according to the committee, was to present a report that will help the government rewrite certain aspects of ancient history. The minutes of the meeting apparently set out its aims to use evidence such as archaeological finds and DNA to prove that today's Hindus are directly descended from the land's first inhabitants many thousands of years ago, and make the case that ancient Hindu scriptures are in fact not myth. And the problem is, of course, that the DNA evidence shows that the people buried there are not related to Aryans that are thought by linguistics and other material to have come out of Central Asia and the steppes and gone westwards through Europe and come eastwards into India. And of course, we share a common language, family of languages called Indo-European languages, but they're not the original inhabitants, according to this, and there were earlier inhabitants. So that's so far what the DNA shows, but it threatened a collaboration with Harvard. There were problems about how to bring this out, because how do you say it? So Hindutva continues to have promoters, and there are academics, and they're not all Indian academics, and there are a lot of European academics sitting in various universities in America and Belgium and so on, who promote some of these views. But others are part of conspiracies and cults. And I just want to tell the story of a woman called Savitri Devi, who actually happened to be the aunt of a friend of mine called Shumanto Banerjee, who's an Indian writer of the left. He had also been an urban Naxal. He actually was a Naxal, not just called one, but he abandoned that. He actually wrote about Naxalism and very critically about the left later. But anyway, he had an aunt who was born to a Greek father, an English mother, who married an Indian and became known as Savitri Devi. And a writer called Maria Maragoni did a brilliant, and I think you can still hear it on BBC iPlayer, a radio documentary about her. So she became a passionate fascist. And having traveled to India, she learned Indian languages, married a Brahmin whom she believed to be an Aryan like herself, and forged an elaborate synthesis of Nazism and Hindu myth in which Hitler was a man against time and destined to bring about the end of the Kali Yuga, the Dark Ages, and usher in a golden age of Aryan supremacy. In her time, she was venerated by the Hindu right and by European and American Nazis. Today, she is being rediscovered by Golden Dawn and the alt-right. And Maria Maragoni writes, it isn't hard to find discussions of her book on neo-Nazi web forums, especially The Lightning and Sun, which expounds the theory that Hitler was an avatar, an incarnation of the Hindu god Vishnu, and Gold in the Furnace, which urges true believers to trust that National Socialism will rise again. The American extreme right website Countercurrent hosts an extensive online archive of her life and work. And her views are reaching a wider public through alt-right leaders such as Richard Spencer, Steve Bannon, former Trump strategist and chair of Breitbart, who've taken up the account of history as a cyclical battle between good and evil, a theory she shared with other 20th century mystical fascists. Now, there's much that I've left out, including the writers' movement that objected to the killing of the rationalists and the lynchings by returning their awards, scientists who returned their awards, actual classic terrorism where Hindu groups decided that they would answer Muslim terrorism bomb for bomb, as they said, blast for blast, and put bombs in shrines, in trains, and so on. But one of the things that I want to say about this growing movement is that some of the most frightening things it's doing, it's not doing out of strength, it's doing out of weakness. It is not very popular at the moment, and that is what's making it particularly dangerous. That is why there are these deflections, there are these very obvious stitch-ups going on. I mean, more obvious than normal. Because the government has failed in what it set out to do, came to power not on a Hindutva platform. I mean, that was the rumbling underneath, but it came to power promising development, promising money in people's pockets, promising jobs, and it's failed to do that. And just as these police raids that I started with were being carried out, there'd been a major report from the Reserve Bank saying that one of its flagship policies, which is to withdraw certain currency notes called demonetization, had actually caused a huge dip in the economy's growth. So anybody who thinks that the killing of some Muslims or Christians or others is worth it for a growing economy, they need to think again, because actually it hasn't succeeded in its own aims. And it's also, I think, relevant to say that many of the issues that it has fought are partly against the Muslim as the other, but also about drawing in Dalit movements, Dalit groups, because Dalits and Adivasis, they have heavily proselytized over and have drawn some in, but there has been a war for the hearts and minds of Dalit and Adivasi groups, and there is a war going on with corporate interests, and I don't mean the war of the Marxist-Leninist groups, the Maoists, what are called the Naxals, which I think are utterly dangerous and run protection rackets, as well as murdering people and killing policemen and so on. They run protection rackets and so on in the areas they are. And they, I certainly don't share any sense of commonality with them. But there is a vast range of other groups of rationalists, leftists, liberals, etc., who do see the Indian Constitution as their main protection and who do organize movements around it. And even the foundation of the Arya Samaj in the 19th century, with its concern about population, about conversions, about drawing people back into the fold, is still being echoed today. And the foundation of the Hindutva movement in Maharashtra, where there aren't very many Muslims actually, and there weren't the kind of communal violence that was going on in North India at that time, is quite significant. That some historians have said that there were rationalist movements that were very active in Maharashtra at that time. There had been 19th century social reform rationalist movements, and there had been also Ambedkar organizing and mobilizing. And the people who were killed were also not just writers, but organizers and mobilizers who worked across villages. And in many places, Dabolkar, the first who was killed, was a Maharashtrian activist. In the wake of his death, an anti-superstition law was finally passed that he'd been campaigning for in recognition of his work. So there has always been this back and forth about in what ways you include the most marginalized, in what ways you make them part of the self. Are they there because they have constitutional rights as individual citizens, because they have a right not to have atrocities committed against them? Or they part of the Hindu fold where they become, or the Hindutva fold where they become part of the foot soldiers of atrocities against others, which unfortunately has happened. And that's why the secularism of Indians, like the secularism of Bradlaugh, is one that is founded not only in issues about free speech or the individual conscience or all those things matter. It's founded in an absolute commitment to dealing with the issues of the most marginalized and the most oppressed. Thank you.